last time Marcus Webb's father cried, Marcus was 7 years old, standing in the hallway of their apartment at 3 in the morning, while Deshaun Webb sat at the kitchen table with an electricity bill in one hand and a prayer in the other. Marcus remembered the way the single candle on the table made his father's shadow enormous against the wall. This big man made even bigger by darkness, reduced to a whisper by a piece of paper. He remembered thinking that if a man like his father could be broken by paper, then paper was the most dangerous thing in the world. 22 years later, Marcus understood that it wasn't the paper. It was what the paper represented. The gap between what a man could do with his hands and what the world required of him in return. Deshaun Webb had worked construction his entire adult life. 31 years of steel-toed boots and a hard hat, weathered down to the color of old bone. He drove to sites before sunrise and came home after dark, smelling of concrete dust and machine oil. He never complained. That was the thing about Deshaun that Marcus carried with him like a compass. The man never once opened his mouth to say that life was unfair. He just leaned into it, the way you lean into wind, and kept moving. His wife, Celestine, sold hot plates of food out of a rolling cart she pushed to the bus depot 4 mornings a week. Smothered chicken, candied yams, cornbread so golden it looked like she'd baked it from sunshine. Between the two of them, Marcus and his younger sister Janelle never went hungry. But they also never forgot, not for a single day, that the food on the table was purchased with sacrifice that had no witness. Marcus was a child who paid attention to things other children did not notice. He noticed the heel of his father's work boot, held on with electrical tape for 2 months before Deshaun finally replaced it. He noticed the way Celestine wore the same 3 church dresses in rotation, each one pressed so perfectly it could have fooled anyone who wasn't counting. He noticed that his parents never argued about money in front of him and Janelle, but they did go quiet sometimes at night, a particular kind of quiet that pressed through the walls of their 2-bedroom apartment and sat on Marcus's chest while he lay on his mattress and stared at the ceiling. He decided somewhere around the age of 9, or that he was going to be the solution. Not the kind of solution that children fantasize about, some vague future wealth, some magic turning point, but an actual, deliberate, systematic solution. He was going to outlearn every room he entered. He was going to work harder than anyone expected him to work. And he was going to carry his family out of that apartment on the sheer force of his mind. He was not wrong about his mind. By the time Marcus graduated high school, his teachers used his name as a benchmark. Mr. Okafor, his economics teacher, told the class that Marcus thought in systems, that he didn't just answer questions, he mapped the territory around them. His classmates came to him when they needed explanations broken down into something real and touchable. He tutored 3 of them through AP exams and charged nothing because the idea of taking money from people who had less than he did offended something deep in him. He graduated top of his class. He gave a speech at commencement that made Celestine weep into the shoulder of the woman sitting beside her, a stranger who held her hand without being asked. College was not possible. The numbers didn't reach, and Marcus refused to bury his family in debt for a degree that he wasn't certain would deliver what it promised. Instead, he did something that everyone around him, teachers, neighbors, the pastor at their church, interpreted as modest ambition, but was actually strategic patience. He began applying for every entry-level position he could find in operations, logistics, and project coordination. He understood from his study of economics that the companies doing infrastructure work in the city were growing. He wanted to be inside one of them when it happened. What followed was 18 months of silence so complete it became its own weather system. He sent out 147 applications. He tracked each one in a spreadsheet: company name, date sent, contact information, follow-up date. He followed up on every single one that had a traceable contact. He received 11 responses. Of those, 4 led to interviews. Of the 4 interviews, 2 went well enough that he left the building feeling like something had finally cracked open. That bright, fragile feeling of possibility that lives right at the edge of hope before it becomes expectation. Both sent rejection emails. The worst part was not the rejection. And Marcus had prepared himself for rejection the way a swimmer prepares for cold water. You know it's coming, you breathe through it, you keep moving. The worst part was the specific quality of the silence from the companies that never responded at all. There is something about being entirely unacknowledged that does something particular to a person's sense of their own reality. After a while, Marcus found himself checking his email, not with hope, but with a kind of dull compulsion, the way a person keeps pressing on a bruise just to confirm that it still hurts. He tried other things. He spent 3 weeks helping a cousin with a small painting business before the cousin's truck broke down and the business dissolved. He tried driving for a delivery app for 2 months before the wear on his car made the math impossible. He sold handmade furniture pieces. He'd always been good with wood, had learned it from Deshawn, for a season, but the market was indifferent to quality and he couldn't compete with mass-produced prices. Each thing he tried had a ceiling and the ceiling was low. He started pushing a scrap cart. It was not a decision he announced. He didn't frame it or dress it up in any particular way, not even to himself. A man who lived 3 blocks over, Mr. Clarence Dubois, 70 years old, moved like he was made from the same materials he collected, had been walking his route for years. Marcus had watched him without much thought. Then one afternoon he asked him about it, plainly and directly, the way Marcus did everything. Mr. Dubois told him what he needed to know. It wasn't glamorous money, but it was consistent and it was real. The first morning Marcus pushed that cart through the streets before daylight, wearing his oldest clothes and his most worn-out shoes. He felt the weight of every award he had ever received. Not physically, but in the way certain memories have mass. He thought about the scholarship plaque in his mother's living room, the one she dusted every week for years, even after it became clear the scholarship it celebrated had not opened any particular door. He bent down to pick up a twisted piece of copper pipe from beside a dumpster near a garage, and the feeling in his chest was not shame, exactly. It was something colder, something that asked, without using words, whether the gap between what he had believed possible and what was actually possible was a failure of effort or a failure of the world. He stood up. He kept moving. Weeks passed. He learned the routes the way he had learned everything in his life, methodically, with full attention. He learned which neighborhoods put out the most metal on which days. He learned which scrap dealers gave honest weights and which ones required a second opinion. He learned that copper and aluminum held their value, and that cast iron was heavy, but worth the effort if you had the right buyer. He built himself a small system. It was not enough to change anything, but it was enough to contribute to his family's household, enough to sit at the dinner table without the silence his father used to wear, pressing down on him in return. On the morning that changed everything, Marcus woke up at 5:15 with no particular premonition. He prayed, not the performative prayer of public faith, but the quiet kind, with a kind that was essentially a conversation between a man and whatever was listening. He drank coffee from a thermos. He put on his clothes. He pushed his cart out into the city before it had fully decided to wake up. His route that morning took him east toward a section of the city that had been developing in uneven waves for the past decade. New construction sat beside vacant lots, gated estates with fresh tar on their roads, bumped up against overgrown land, waiting for someone to decide its purpose. Marcus knew a spot near one of these newer developments where construction crews had left behind scrap iron rods the previous week. He'd noticed them on a pass-through and filed the location away for later. He turned into the estate. The roads inside were wide and quiet in the way that expensive places learn to be quiet. Not empty, but controlled. A gardener moved in the distance. A car was parked in a driveway. The morning birds had the loudest voices in the whole place. Marcus pushed his cart toward the back section of the estate, toward the spot where he'd seen the iron rods. He turned a curve in the road near a low stretch of bush running along the inside of the perimeter fence, and that was when he saw it. A bag, black, large, the kind built for serious travel or serious cargo. It sat in the bush about 4 feet off the road, half sheltered by leaves, upright and composed, like it had been placed there rather than dropped. Marcus stopped pushing his cart. He looked at the bag for a long moment without moving toward it. He looked left and right. No one. He looked back at the bag. It was clean. Not dusty, not weathered. Clean. Which meant it had not been there long. He stood still for what might have been a full minute. His mind ran through its inventory of dangers the way it always did when something unexpected entered his field of perception. Drugs, weapons, Someone's discarded problem becoming his problem. He thought about walking away. He thought about it seriously. Then he walked toward it. He crouched beside it without touching it and studied the shape. Firm, dense, heavy from the way it settled against the ground without compression. He pressed one hand very lightly against the side and felt solid, compressed weight. Not the loose weight of something poured in, but the flat, organized weight of something stacked. He pulled his hand back. His heartbeat was doing things that his composure was working hard to manage. He stood up and stepped back. And he looked around the estate one more time. A curtain shifted in a window far down the road. He couldn't tell if anyone was actually there. He made a decision. He didn't dramatize the decision or hold a conversation with himself about it. He simply decided that whatever was in this bag, he was not going to leave it in a bush for someone with worse intentions to find. He pulled the bag to his cart, lifted it with both arms, and a grunt that surprised him, and covered it with the flat iron sheets already in the cart. He took the long way home. Smaller roads, fewer people. His shirt was damp before he'd gone 3 blocks. The house was empty when he arrived. His parents were both out. He brought the bag inside, closed the door, and placed it in the middle of the living room floor. Then he sat down in front of it, back against the wall, with knees drawn up, and looked at it for a very long time. When he finally pulled the zipper open, the room seemed to tilt slightly. Stacks of money, bundled and banded, packed from the base of the bag to near the top. Dense as a dictionary. Different denominations. The slight variance in color told him there were different currencies. Mostly dollars, but others mixed in. He sat completely still and looked at it the way a person looks at something they have genuinely never seen before and cannot quite force into a category. He did not touch the bills. He sat with his hands flat on the floor on either side of him. After several minutes, he noticed the documents, folded flat beneath the top layer of bills, organized and protected. He lifted them out carefully and opened them on the floor. He read slowly and completely, and they were contract documents, a formal payment agreement between 2 parties for a significant infrastructure deal. There were signatures, official stamps, printed names, and a company letterhead with an address in the commercial district of the city. He read everything twice. Then he sat back and breathed slowly. The money was not random. It was not criminal, at least not on its face. It was payment, large cash form payment for a legitimate contract, which meant someone had lost it, which meant it had an owner, which meant it belonged somewhere that was not Marcus Webb's living room floor. He folded the documents back along their original creases and placed them on the floor beside him. He looked at the open bag for one more long moment. Then he zipped it closed, stood up, pushed it under the frame of his parents' bed, and went to the kitchen to make himself something to eat. He did not sleep that night. He lay on his back in the dark and allowed himself exactly one honest inventory of what the money could do. Rent, 4 months covered, his sister's nursing school application fees, his father's knee surgery, the one Deshawn kept postponing because the recovery time meant missed work, a car that didn't need tape on the dashboard, a real business, the kind with a proper address and an actual plan, a chance to stop pushing a cart through the dark before sunrise. He allowed himself to see all of it. Then he let it go, not because it was easy, not because the wanting wasn't real. He let it go because he was his father's son, and his father had taught him, without ever saying the words directly, that a man's integrity was not a thing you held on to only when it was convenient. It was the thing you held on to especially when it was inconvenient, especially when it cost you something real. The money was not his. That was the full and complete answer to every question the night was asking him. He would find its owner. 3 days before Marcus Webb found that bag, Raymond Ellington Stokes had been standing at the window of his 5th-floor office, watching the city below, with the specific expression of a man who has outrun his circumstances so completely that he sometimes wonders if they are still following. Raymond, everyone who worked for him called him Mr. Stokes, and only his wife and 3 people from his past called him Ray, had built Stokes' infrastructure from nothing. Not the kind of nothing that is poetic shorthand, but actual nothing. No capital, no connections, no family name that opened doors in any relevant room. What he had was an engineering mind, a construction worker's work ethic he'd inherited from a father who spent 30 years building other people's buildings, and a tolerance for discomfort that had been trained into him by years of early failure before the first real success. The company now ran infrastructure contracts across 4 states: roads, drainage systems, bridges, municipal utilities. 62 full-time employees, a reputation for finishing on time and under budget that was unusual enough in the industry to be genuinely valuable. Raymond had done it by being meticulous, by trusting a small circle of people completely and keeping that circle small, and by applying to his business the same rule his mother had applied to their household when he was growing up in Decatur, Georgia. Waste nothing, promise only what you can deliver, and when the work is done right, let it speak. He was not a man who panicked easily. He had been in difficult situations before. A contract that nearly bankrupted the company in year 3. A lawsuit from a former partner that took 2 years to resolve. A period when payroll arrived 3 days late, and he personally called every single employee to explain why and when it would be corrected. He had handled all of it with a steadiness that his team interpreted as confidence, but which Raymond knew was really just a practice decision not to show the room how bad it felt. But this situation was different, and he knew it the moment he drove back to that stretch of road near the estate and pushed his hands through the leaves and found nothing. He had received the contract payment that morning, cash as stipulated in the original terms, which had struck him as unusual but not unprecedented. The issuing firm was government-linked and had particular reasons for the arrangement, none of which were Raymond's concern. He had signed for it, verified the count, packed it into the bag, and begun the drive back to the office, intending to deposit it that afternoon through the appropriate channels. He had been followed. He noticed it with the particular alertness of someone who has operated in environments where situational awareness is not optional. A black car, maintaining a careful distance. He ran the counter route protocol that some years of navigating complex contract environments had taught him. Not paranoia, just caution. And when the car stayed with him through 3 unnecessary turns, his stomach dropped with the cold certainty of a man whose read of the situation has just been confirmed. He had made the decision to hide the bag in a practiced second of calm that he would later not be entirely able to explain. He saw the low bush. He saw the gap near the fence. He saw 2 large stones he could use as a marker. He was out of the car and back in it within 45 seconds. He drove hard and made it 3 blocks before they boxed him in. They found nothing in the car because there was nothing in the car. He told them there was no bag, that the payment had been left at the signing location. They hit him across the shoulder with something solid, not a fist, and he went down on the asphalt and they searched the car with efficient, practiced movements that told him this was not their first time. They found nothing. There was an argument he couldn't fully hear, and then they were gone, and he lay face down on the warm road, breathing slowly until he was sure they weren't coming back. When he returned to the bush, the bag was gone. He sat in his car for over an hour. The sequence of what had happened assembled itself in his mind with terrible clarity. The criminals had failed to get the bag. Someone else had found it. The documents inside it carried his company's name, his signature, the full details of the contract. If those documents surfaced in the wrong way, if whoever found the bag decided to use them as leverage, or tried to return them through some official channel that triggered an investigation into the timing of the deposit, the consequences could reach every corner of what he had spent 15 years building. He managed his public face with the discipline of long practice. He went to meetings. He signed papers. He answered calls. His longtime senior manager, Elton, who had been with him for 6 years and could read the temperature of a room that contained Raymond Stokes more accurately than most people could read a room they were actually in, asked him once if everything was all right. Raymond said yes, and Elton didn't push, but his eyes said he didn't believe it. Raymond sent quiet inquiries. He had Chucks, his head of security, a man whose value was precisely that he asked very few questions and remembered everything. Begin canvassing the neighborhoods near the estate, scrap dealers, market traders, anyone who might know a young man with a cart who worked that area. The information came back thin and slow. A description emerged over several days. Young, thin, quiet manner, pushed his cart toward the newer east side of the development regularly. On the fourth morning, Raymond arrived at his office before 7 and was reviewing a project file when his front desk administrator knocked on his open door and held out a document with an expression that told him, before he'd read a single word, that it was something that required his immediate, complete attention. He looked at it. He stood up. He walked downstairs. He pushed through the front door. And he saw a young man standing near the gate in a faded shirt that had been ironed to within an inch of its life, holding an envelope, looking at the building the way people look at places that they are uncertain will let them in. Raymond walked toward him. He stopped. He looked at the young man for a long moment. The worn shoes, the steady eyes, the particular stillness of someone who has rehearsed this moment without knowing exactly what would happen next. He said simply, "Come with me." In his office, with the door closed and his calls held, Raymond asked Marcus to tell him everything, from the beginning, exactly as it happened. He leaned forward with both elbows on the desk and watched the young man's face as he talked. He had spent 15 years evaluating people, reading the gap between what they said and what they meant, watching where a person's eyes went when they reached the part of the story that tested them. He watched Marcus Webb tell the story of finding the bag, taking it home, reading the documents, and deciding to return it. And not once did the young man's account have the texture of performance. It was plain and complete and delivered with the economy of someone who has given himself no alternative narrative to fall back on. When Marcus finished, Raymond asked the question that mattered. Where was the bag now? Marcus said it was at home, under his parents' bed. He had not touched the money. He had not moved a single bill. Raymond sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Marcus and asked if he was willing to take him there now. Marcus said yes. At the house, Raymond watched the neighborhood receive his car the way neighborhoods receive anything that doesn't belong, with a full-body awareness, the sideways looks, the children stopping, the women at the roadside letting their eyes follow. He got out and looked at the building, the weathered paint, the small yard, the thin window. He had grown up in a house not unlike this one, and for a moment the feeling this produced in him was so sharp it was almost physical. Inside, Marcus went directly to the bedroom. He came back with the bag. He placed it on the floor and stepped back. He did not position himself between Raymond and the bag. He did not watch it with the eyes of someone calculating what it was worth. He just stepped back and waited. Raymond checked the contents. Every bundle in place, every document undisturbed, including a folded receipt that he had not expected to be there, that Marcus had apparently handled without opening. He stood up and looked at the young man standing in the doorway of his parents' living room and felt something move in him that he could not immediately name. Something between disbelief and a kind of recognition. They drove in silence to the bank. Raymond went inside. 40 minutes later, he came out looking the way a man looks when a weight that has been compressing his chest for days is suddenly, structurally removed. Not happy exactly, just lighter. Back at the office, Raymond poured water and asked Marcus to tell him about his life. Not the bag, his life. Marcus was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a person deciding how much truth the room can hold. Then he spoke. He spoke plainly, the way he had described finding the bag, without drama, without the protective inflation that people sometimes use when they need a listener to understand how difficult things have been. He described his parents, the applications, the rejections, the small businesses that found their ceilings quickly, the cart. Raymond listened to all of it and said nothing until Marcus was finished. Then he said what he knew to be true, that he had met many people in 15 years of business who were smart, educated, and well-connected, and that the specific quality Marcus had demonstrated, sitting with a fortune that was not his for days and returning it entirely intact, was not common. He said this without sentimentality. He said it the way he would say it in a board meeting, as an observable fact about a resource that had genuine strategic value. He was about to make his proposal when his phone rang, and the situation took a turn neither of them had expected. The contract firm had heard rumors. The timeline of the deposit had drawn questions. The person on the other end of the line was not unfriendly, but was very clear. If the funds could not be confirmed as properly received and processed within 48 hours, The entire agreement was at risk, and a formal review was possible. Raymond kept his voice level. He told them the funds were being processed. He told them documentation would follow. He put the phone down and sat with the new dimension of the problem. The documents were intact, but the timeline had a gap. When the deposit had happened days after the contract signing, his legal team would need to construct a clean account of the delay, not false, but shaped. A security concern during transport, plausible and undetectable. His lawyers were good, and they moved quickly. And by late afternoon the following day, the contract firm had accepted the documentation package and confirmed the agreement as fully active. Raymond closed the email. He sat in his chair. The immediate crisis had passed. But the image of Marcus Webb standing in that living room doorway, having stepped back from a bag full of money he could have kept, would not leave him. Then Elton came in and closed the door, and the situation produced one more complication that Raymond had not anticipated. When the network that had followed him the day of the handover, the people who had boxed him in on the road and searched his car, had not gone quiet. They had traced the path of the money back toward a young man with a cart. They were already making inquiries in the neighborhoods near the estate. Two of Chuck's contacts had confirmed. The people who had tried to rob him were now looking for the person who had found the bag. They were getting close. One of them had already been to a scrap dealer who remembered Marcus's direction. Raymond felt the cold understanding of a situation that had not finished with him yet, and called Marcus immediately. The voice on the phone had a quality that Marcus recognized from the rare moments in life when the ground beneath a situation reveals itself to be less solid than it appeared. Raymond Stokes did not shout. He did not use words designed to alarm, but the firmness underneath every syllable communicated, with perfect efficiency, that this was not a precaution. This was a directive. Stay inside, lock the door. Open it for no one. I'm sending someone. Marcus sat by the door of his parents' house and tried to organize what he felt into something manageable. He had returned the bag. He had done the right thing, which was supposed to be the thing that simplified a situation, not the thing that complicated it further. He wanted to call his mother and tell her to come home early from her cart, but he didn't want to deliver fear without context, and there was no version of the context that would produce anything other than fear. 20 minutes later, there was a knock. And he didn't open it until the voice on the other side confirmed who sent them. Two men came in, large, quiet, economical in their movements, the kind of quiet that is not passivity, but the opposite of it. One took a position by the window without being directed. The other stood near the door. Celestine Webb came home an hour later and dropped her tray. The sound of it, the crack of the wooden tray against the floor, the scatter of small containers, Celestine's voice going sharp with alarm, was the sound of Marcus's protected world colliding with the world he had accidentally stepped into. He ran from the bedroom and spent several minutes talking his mother down from the edge of a panic attack while one of the security men stood against the wall and had the good sense to be completely still. Deshawn came home 30 minutes after that. He surveyed the room. He looked at the two strangers. He looked at his son. He sat down in the corner chair and said, with the particular economy of a man who saves his words for when they matter, "Tell me what you got yourself into." So Marcus told them everything. He sat across from his parents in the living room of the apartment where he had grown up and told the whole story from the beginning. The bag, the documents, the decision, Raymond Stokes' office, the phone call, the reason the men were in their home. He told it the same way he had told Raymond, plainly, completely, without embellishment. The room was very still when he finished. The security men stood like furniture. Outside, a child somewhere was bouncing a ball against the sidewalk, the steady rhythm of it indifferent to everything happening inside the apartment. Aunt Celestine pressed both hands over her mouth. She held them there. Then she took them away and said the only thing she could find in the entire situation that was solid and unambiguous, that her son had done the right thing. She said it quietly, the way she said things that were simply true. Deshawn looked at Marcus for a long moment. He nodded once. He said nothing else. But Marcus understood his father's silence with the fluency of 29 years. The nod meant, "I know who you are. I have always known who you are. This confirms it." Marcus went to the kitchen and made tea because he needed to do something with his hands, and tea was the most useful thing he could think of. Raymond arrived the next morning in a car that was less conspicuous than the one he usually drove. He asked Marcus's parents to give them the room, and to his slight surprise, they agreed without protest. Celestine watching her son from the doorway with the expression of a woman who has done all she can do and has now placed the rest in someone else's hands. He told Marcus everything: the robbery attempt, the criminals who had followed him from the signing, the network, a man named Oakley who ran a quiet operation of street-level criminal activity through carefully positioned informants. Oakley's people hadn't gotten the money, but they had traced the recovery back to a young man with a cart who operated in that area. They were close. Marcus listened without interrupting. When Raymond finished, he asked the question that was most precise. Would these men come to his home? Raymond said yes. It was a real possibility. That was why they were moving quickly. Marcus pushed back, not from fear, but from the instinct of someone who had spent his whole life calibrating the needs of others against his own. He could not simply leave. His parents would need a full explanation. They would need to choose. Raymond said he understood. He said every hour in that house was risk. He said his security team was already actively working on containing the immediate threat. But until that work was done, Marcus and his family needed to be somewhere that was not there. That evening, there was a conversation in the apartment that Marcus would later place alongside the most significant moments of his life. Not because of its drama, but because of its honesty. His mother cried, not from fear, or not only from fear. She cried from the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent 30 years doing everything right and still lived in an apartment with a window that let in more cold than light. And now her son's goodness, the thing she had worked her whole life to instill in him, had produced this. Deshaun sat with his hands on his knees and did not speak for a long time. Then he looked at Raymond Stokes, sitting across from him in the small living room, and said, with the directness of a man who has earned the right to ask, "Are you going to take care of my son?" Raymond looked back at him without flinching and said yes. They left that night in 2 vehicles. Marcus looked back at the apartment as the car pulled away. The cracked paint, the thin window, and the yard where Celestine kept 3 plastic chairs and a pot of geraniums that somehow survived everything. He turned forward and put his hands in his lap and breathed slowly. Oakley's people came to the house the next morning. They knocked. No answer. They tried the gate. Locked from outside. One of them looked through the narrow gap in the gate, saw the empty yard, stood there for a moment that Marcus would only learn about secondhand, and then walked away to make a phone call. They were too late. What happened next was the part that Raymond handled with the efficiency and controlled force of someone who had spent 15 years learning when quiet management becomes insufficient. He went to an investigative unit he had a prior relationship with, not the local precinct, but a senior organized crime unit that operated above the neighborhood level. He gave them the full account of the armed robbery, the car, the weapons, the men, the attempted theft of contract funds. He gave them everything he legally could. The unit moved fast because the case had serious components. Within 48 hours, warrants had been issued. Within 72, 3 of Oakley's main associates were in custody following coordinated early morning operations. Oakley himself had moved, but was running out of geography. Marcus knew none of this in real time. He was at the house Raymond had arranged, gated, private, quiet in a way that was entirely unlike the kind of quiet that had pressed through the walls of his childhood bedroom. His mother had found the kitchen and had begun cooking the moment they arrived, because Celestine Webb's response to any unfamiliar territory was to feed it. His father sat in the small garden and watched the birds and said very little, which was his version of being at peace. Marcus read. The bookshelf in the sitting room had a sparse but serious collection. Economic history, civil engineering references, 2 novels he worked through in 2 days. Raymond called once a day, brief and calm. The message was always the same. Stay put, it's being handled. On the 4th day, Chuck's called. Oakley had been apprehended at a checkpoint on the eastern road out of the city. The immediate threat was neutralized. Raymond would come that afternoon. Marcus sat with the phone in his hand and looked at the ceiling for a long time. He heard his mother moving in the kitchen. He heard his father's slow, unhurried footsteps in the hallway. He placed the phone on the table and sat very still with his hands in his lap, and felt for the first time in a very long time that the air in the room was simply air. Not weighted, not charged with anything, just air. When Raymond arrived, he sat with Marcus in the sitting room and told him everything in a complete account. The arrests, the charges, the case being formally processed, the careful legal work that had kept Marcus's name out of the public filings. He talked through all of it methodically. Then he set the information down and was quiet for a moment. He said he had been thinking about Marcus since the day he walked into his office. He said he had turned it over many times. Not the act itself, which anyone could perform once under the right circumstances, but the consistency of it. The way Marcus had carried himself through the entire sequence of events. Calm, direct, no performance, no attempt to extract additional value from a situation that had handed him considerable leverage if he had wanted to use it. He said the thing that had cost him most over 15 years of building his company was not capital or difficult contracts or competitive markets. It was finding people he could trust with the full weight of something important. Then he said he wanted to offer Marcus a position. Marcus went quiet. He looked at Raymond for a moment. Then he asked what kind of position. Raymond was precise about it. An operations support role. Real work, substantive work. The kind that would teach him the structural logic of the business from the inside. A fair salary, on the expectation that Marcus would grow quickly and take on more responsibility as he demonstrated his capacity. And then Raymond said the thing that marked the offer as something other than charity. He said none of this was pity. He said he was not doing Marcus a favor out of obligation. He said he was doing it because he needed someone with exactly the quality Marcus had already demonstrated. And most people took years to prove that quality in ways that were considerably less definitive than what Marcus had already done. The decision was Marcus's. Raymond would understand either way. Marcus asked for one night. Raymond said of course, and left. Marcus sat in the room after his parents had gone to bed and allowed the night to hold all of it. He thought about 18 months of silence from 147 applications. He thought about the cart. He thought about the bag sitting open on the living room floor of his family's apartment, the way the money had looked in the candlelight quality of the afternoon, the way he had pressed his hands flat on the floor beside him, as if he needed the ground to hold him steady. He thought about what Raymond had said about trust. He thought about his father's nod. He called Raymond before breakfast the next morning. He said yes. Remy said good. He said he would arrange everything. His first day at Stokes Infrastructure was a Monday in October. He arrived early. Raymond introduced him to the team himself. Brief, direct, no explanation of the full story. Just, Marcus Webb, Operations Division, please work with him openly. Marcus was given a desk, a folder, access credentials to the project management system. He sat down, opened the folder, and began reading. His hands were still. His breathing was steady. The room around him was full of the ordinary productive noise of people working, and he understood, with the clarity that comes from having been a long time without ordinary productive noise, that he was sitting inside the thing he had been trying to reach for a very long time. The early weeks were not easy. There was a great deal to learn, and Marcus approached the learning the way he approached everything, with complete attention and the willingness to be at the bottom of a thing before he was at the top of it. Some of his colleagues were openly warm. Others were cautious in the specific way that people are cautious around someone whose arrival they can't fully explain. And there were moments that tested him, a meeting he was not included in when he should have been, a task assigned to him that was clearly below the level of what he was capable of doing, an indirect comment that was designed to locate him in the room's hierarchy without having the courage to do so directly. He came in every morning and did the work. He asked questions when he didn't understand something, and he never asked the same question twice. He worked late and didn't make a performance of it. Raymond watched from a measured distance, checking in briefly each week, not to manage him, but to see how he was finding the work, whether there was anything he needed. After 2 months, Raymond began including Marcus in the broader briefings. After 3, he gave him a coordination project to manage independently. Marcus managed it carefully, or communicated clearly, delivered it on time, and the results were clean and accurate. Raymond read the project report and said nothing to Marcus directly, but something was settled in his understanding of the investment he had made. Back at the family apartment, Celestine walked in on the first day of their return and stopped in the front room. The walls had been repainted. The roof had been sealed. New weather stripping ran along the bottom of the front door. She stood in the middle of the room and sat down in the nearest chair and cried for a short while with her hands in her lap. Not from sadness, but from the specific emotion that arrives when something you have quietly endured for a very long time is, without announcement, corrected. Deshaun walked through each room slowly with one hand trailing along the wall. He went to the back, sat in the garden, and closed his eyes in the morning sun. He stayed there for a long time. Marcus stood in the doorway to the yard and watched his father sit there in the light and felt, rising in him from somewhere beneath language, a feeling he had no single word for. It was made from relief and grief and pride and love and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been trying very hard for a very long time and has finally arrived somewhere that feels like it was worth arriving at. There was an evening, months after all of it, when Marcus was alone in the office after everyone had gone home. The lights in the main floor had gone to their low evening setting. His desk lamp was the only sharp light in the room. He sat back in his chair and looked at the city through the window, the particular nighttime architecture of a city that never fully sleeps, the lights layered and busy in the distance. He let himself think about the morning he had found the bag. He let himself stand again in that moment, the sharp beat of his heart, the sweat on his face in the cool morning air, the weight of the bag when he lifted it with both arms. He allowed himself to sit again on the floor of his family's living room with the bag open in front of him and the quiet of the house around him and the money visible in its dense, organized stacks. He thought about the choice, not the choice to return it, in the deep structural part of him that had never genuinely been a choice, any more than breathing was a choice. What he thought about was the harder, quieter thing, the years of trying, the 147 applications, the rejection emails, the ceiling that every small effort found, the mornings when getting up required a kind of force that he had never told anyone he had needed. He thought about whether any of that had been wasted. He decided it had not. Not a day of it. Not a single failed interview or cold silence or cracked piece of copper pipe lifted from beside a dumpster in the pre-dawn dark. Every piece of it had shaped the specific quality that had been in the room the morning Raymond Stokes walked toward him outside his gate. The patience, the stillness, the integrity that holds when it costs something real. You don't build that in good times, you build it in the long middle of things. When in the years that don't announce themselves as meaningful, but turn out to have been the most important years of your life. He turned back to his work. He opened the folder on his desk and picked up his pen and continued writing the report that was due in the morning. Across the city, Deshaun Webb was sitting in his chair after dinner, the television on low, his work boots by the door as always. Celestine was in the kitchen doing the small organizational rituals of the end of the day, the sounds of it drifting through the apartment with the comfortable frequency of something that has happened 10,000 times and will happen 10,000 more. They were not finished struggling. Life does not resolve itself in clean chapters, but the specific quality of the difficulty had changed. It was the same weight, but they were stronger now, and then strength changes the weight of everything you carry. Here is what this story is actually about, and it is not what it appears to be at the surface. It is not about a man who found money and returned it and was rewarded. The reward is not the point. Rewards are conditional. They depend on the Raymond Stokeses of the world noticing, on timing, on 100 variables that could have aligned differently and often do. What the story's about is simpler and harder than that. It is about what it costs to be the kind of person who does the right thing in the dark, when no one is watching, when the cost is real and the benefit is invisible, and the night is giving you every possible reason to make a different decision. Marcus Webb did not return that bag because he knew it would open a door. He returned it because he could not have lived with himself if he hadn't. Because his parents had built him to be someone for whom integrity was not a strategy, but a foundation. And a foundation does not become negotiable when the building gets heavy. The door opened because someone saw that foundation clearly and recognized it for what it was. But the foundation was there before the door. The foundation was there in the years of silence and failure, in early mornings and tired evenings. The foundation was there on the living room floor in front of an open bag full of money that Marcus Webb did not touch. That is what the story's about. The rest is consequence.